Today's scripture reading comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 14 through 27. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Now, if the foot should say, "Because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body," it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, "Because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body," it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body was an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as He wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, "I don't need you," and the head cannot say to the feet, "I don't need you." On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. The word of the Lord.
Thank you, Walt. Good morning, Hope. It's so good to be here with you. I have such a deep love for your church and for your pastors. Drew is one of my favorite human beings in the world. He's been such a huge blessing to me personally, to our family, and to our community out in LA. He's basically an assistant pastor at our church at this point. He's come and preached multiple times for us. He led our men's retreat back in January. He's done a couple dating seminars. And then he and Tina are coming back for a marriage weekender in August. So thank you for sharing him with us. But all this to say, Hope has a really special place in my heart, and I'm always grateful to be able to serve your community. The last time I was here was actually in May of last year. I came with my family to preach at Hope, and what a difference a year makes. My wife used to live in New York for 5 years. I used to be on the East Coast, so we're very familiar with the city. But my kids, that was their first time in New York, and they were traumatized because they got here, and we told them, you have to walk faster in New York than you do in LA. They didn't believe us, and the first time we walked across the street, the crossing guard starts yelling at my son. He's like, "Walk with a purpose, man, walk with a purpose," and so he's freaked out by that. We get off the plane, we get into the city. The first street we cross, the crossing guard's like, "How you doing, man?" And we're like, "How you doing? Like, what kind of city is, what is going on?" I walk into a bagel shop, and I'm used to East Coast workers being really annoyed at me because I'm from LA, and so I take my time ordering. I'm so sorry if I'm triggering you, but I take my time ordering. I'm like, what do I want? And I'm used to them, giving me a really annoyed look. But I walked into Utopia Bagels, and she was like, "Take your time, sir. Let me know if you need any Rex." I was like, "Need any Rex? Like, what is going on?" I was trying to figure this out with my wife, like, what is going on? And I realized it's the Knicks. It's the Knicks, right? And I realized there has been a fundamental shift in identity in this city, okay? For 53 years, you had this team that was trying to prove themselves, right? Hoping for the best, but, always expecting the worst, right? And one magical playoff run, and now you have an entire city walking around with their heads held high. The air is different, it's palpable, right? You have everyone saying, "No, we're that team now. We belong here, we're winners." And you realize identity has a way of shaping how we carry ourselves. It has a way of shaping how we show up in the world. And if a championship can do that for an entire city, I want you to imagine what happens when you actually find out who you are. And I think that's ultimately the heartbeat behind this series y'all have been in called Made for Mission. Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, that we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus for good works that he prepared in advance for us to do. In other words, every single one of us in this room is God's workmanship, God's masterpiece, crafted with intention and care to reflect God's image in a way that no one else can. And what this means is that you don't have to spend your entire life trying to prove yourself. You don't have to wonder whether you're somehow deficient. You don't have to compare yourself to everyone around you. God has already declared that you were made on purpose. God has already declared you belong here. You are that person that I've created. He's given you a unique combination of gifts and passions and experiences that no one else possesses in exactly the same way. And he didn't simply create you to have those things. He created you to offer those things. Every part of who you are was meant to become a gift for the sake of others. Which brings us to today's topic, personality. Now, I have never preached a sermon on personality, but when Walt asked me to preach on this topic, I was all in, because if you know me, you know I love all personality tests, all personality assessments, and I don't think I'm the only one, right? Because we're living in a world right now where everyone wants to know who they are. Everywhere you look, there's a different assessment. Strengths finders, Myers-Briggs, blood type, right? Enneagram, which is my personal favorite. Everyone's asking each other, what's your type? What's your sign? What's your working style? What Harry Potter house are you, right? I mean, we love putting language to our personalities because deep down, we all want an answer to the same fundamental question. Who am I? And we're all asking, who am I? Because here's what's interesting. It feels like the more language we have for personality, the less content we are with our own. Right? Some of us wish we were more outgoing. Some of us wish we were more confident in front of other people. Some of us wish we were more organized or calm or charismatic. And I resonate with this so deeply because, if you were at the workshop yesterday, I'm an Enneagram type 9. And if you're familiar with the Enneagram, you know that Enneagram 9s are peacemakers. We tend to be very conflict avoidant. We're often scared to speak our minds. We hate having tough conversations. And of course, God looks at that and says, perfect, I'm going to make you the lead pastor of a church in LA, right? A city that is ground zero for so much of the social, racial, cultural tension that exists in the world today. And my first year of ministry was actually in 2020. Okay, so this was a year when it felt like every single week, every pastor in America was asked to make a definitive statement about some divisive issue that was going on. And I remember during that time wondering, why am I this way? This is so hard for me, right? I wanted to be that charismatic, confident leader who exuded just so much security that made people feel safe. But people would ask me, hey, Jason, can you weigh in on this controversy? And I'd be like, I don't know if it's that black and white. Or they say, wait, Jason, where does our church stand on this? And I'd be like, that's a great question. Give me a week and let me get back to you on that. And I used to go home being like, why am I in this role? Why couldn't I be different? There are so many more people more fit to lead this church than I am. And I realize this is human nature. Every time I teach a class on the Enneagram, someone asks the question, hey, can I change my type? Right? Is there any way I can be someone else's type? Is there any way I can be nurtured into a different type? And I realize there's this quiet underlying dissatisfaction with who we are. And so we spend our entire lives admiring the strengths God gave to other people that we fail to steward the gifts he's entrusted to us. We assume that if we were more like so-and-so, then we'd finally become the type of person God could use, the type of person people would love. And this isn't a modern problem. This is exactly the impulse the Apostle Paul is speaking against in the text we just read together. Paul here is writing to a church in Corinth where people were basically ranking each other based on how they were wired. So you had some people who were being treated as less than, some people who were being treated as less spiritual or less necessary based on their specific wiring. And then you had others who were being elevated and celebrated and honored because of their specific wiring. And Paul's response to this is this kind of comedic picture of a body having an identity crisis, right? He imagines a foot looking at a hand saying, well, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to this body. He imagines an ear looking at an eye saying the same thing. And his whole point is that a body made up of only eyes can't hear anything. A body made up of only ears can't see anything. The very things that make you different from the person you're sitting next to are the very reason the body works at all. See, if I could build on Paul's metaphor, some of you in this room are the eyes of the body, right? You see what's coming. You read a room. You anticipate a problem. You're always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Some of you are the ears of the body. You listen in a way that make people feel like they're the only person in the room. You make people feel so seen and known. Some of you are the hands. You're the executors. You make things happen. You do the things nobody else wants to do. One body, many parts. And this is a consistent motif in all of Paul's letters. If you go to Ephesians chapter 4, he says there's one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God. There's this theme of oneness. But then immediately after that, he says, but to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. Meaning, yes, there's one God, there's one mission, there's one body, but no 2 people have been graced in exactly the same way. Christ has entrusted each of us with a unique expression of his life so that together we can reveal more of him than any one of us could alone. Uniformity and sameness was never the goal. But now see, it's one thing to know that conceptually, it's another thing to actually live that out. Because if we're honest, a lot of us spend our lives looking sideways, comparing, competing, wondering, how come I can't talk like them? How come my mind doesn't work like theirs? How come I'm not as charismatic as they are? We try to wear personalities that don't quite fit because we assume that's the kind of person you need to be if you want to be successful. That's the kind of person you need to be if you want to be loved. I always come back to one of my favorite stories in the life of David. And I share this story a lot at our church, partly because I resonate with it so much in my own leadership. But it's the story of David going out to fight Goliath, right? And in the story, David goes up to Saul, who is king of Israel at the time, and he says, let me go fight this Philistine. Well, the first thing out of Saul's mouth is, you're too young and you're not built like a warrior, right? Translation, you don't have what it takes to beat this guy. Right, but I love David's response. He says, well, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. David's saying, you're right, I'm not a warrior. I'm a shepherd. I don't think like a warrior. I think like a shepherd. I move like a shepherd. I protect like a shepherd. David clearly knows who he is and who he's not. But see, Saul still doesn't get it, right? Which is why he then says, okay, fine, you want to go out there? Then put this on. And he gives David his armor. Because in Saul's mind, he's still thinking, well, if you're going to fight like a king, you got to go dressed like a king. On paper, it makes perfect sense. This is the best armor in Israel. It's tested. It's worked before. But if you know the story, David tries it on. He takes a few steps and he basically says, I can't fight in this. It's too big. It doesn't fit. Like, this is clunky. There's no way. And so he takes the armor off and instead grabs his staff, his 5 stones and a sling, and walks onto the battlefield. And here's the point. David doesn't defeat Goliath in spite of putting down someone else's armor. He defeats Goliath because he put down someone else's armor. If David goes out there dressed like Saul, fighting like Saul, trying to be Saul, he loses every time. And he doesn't lose because Saul's armor is bad. No, it's because Saul's armor belongs to Saul. It's not David's to wear. I wonder how many of us are trying to fight our battles wearing somebody else's armor, somebody else's personality, somebody else's calling, somebody else's leadership style, because we've convinced ourselves, hey, we need to lead like that person. We need to speak like that person. We need to strategize like that person. We need to parent like that person. But see, God never asked you to be the best version of someone else. He asked you to become the fullest version of the person he created you to be. Now, quick caveat. Before we all walk away saying, you know what? You're right. This is who I am. I don't have to apologize for anything. Right? You don't like me, too bad. Right? New Yorkers love that message. You don't like me, too bad. I do want to make a really important distinction. Not everything that feels like me is actually the me God created me to be. Okay? Meaning, you could wear armor that actually looks like it's yours, but in reality isn't. Let me explain. Remember the eyes and the ears and the hands, right? Well, every one of those parts has a healthy version and an unhealthy version, right? Carl Jung used the language of your true self and your shadow self, right? The Apostle Paul frequently uses the language of your new self and your old self, right? And all of these are pointing to the same reality, that there's a version of you that reflects the image of God more fully, and then there's a version of you that's been distorted by sin, by fear, by pride, by shame, and all the ways we've learned to hide and survive in a broken world. And this is so important because as much as the gospel isn't trying to erase your personality, it's also not trying to excuse your personality. The gospel seeks to redeem your personality. Right? God isn't asking the hand to become an eye. It's not asking the hand to become a foot. But he's also not asking the eye to keep seeing through a distorted lens. Right? He's asking the eye to see the way it was created to see. A healthy eye sees what's true. An unhealthy eye only sees what's wrong. They both see very differently. Right? What was meant to be discernment becomes hypercriticism and judgment. A healthy ear listens so people feel seen and known. An unhealthy ear collects that same information but stops holding it as sacred and turns it into gossip. A healthy hand serves. An unhealthy hand controls. Same function, different master. See, sin doesn't give us a brand new personality. It hijacks the one we already have. Fear and shame and pride start to mar who you've been created to be, and the very thing God meant as a gift to the body starts to become a weapon or a wall you use to hide or survive. Now, I want to be very careful here because I know that for a lot of us, our shadow selves didn't surface because we were trying to be rebellious or we just wanted to be bad people. Right? No, they surfaced because somewhere along the way, we learned that the person God created us to be didn't feel safe. Maybe you grew up in a home where chaos was normal. And so you learned at a very early age to scan the room for danger before anyone else even noticed something was wrong. And because that hypervigilance kept you safe as a kid, it just followed you into adulthood as criticism, as never being able to relax and just enjoy your life without finding all the flaws first. Maybe you grew up in a home where love felt conditional, where you learned that if you didn't hold everything together, nobody else would. And so you learned to grab control of everything, not because you're a control freak by nature, but because control was the only thing that ever kept you safe. Or maybe you grew up in an environment where you were never heard, where your opinions didn't matter, where you got talked over all the time, where you learned that if you didn't speak up loud and first, you disappear into the background. And so you became an adult, and then you became as loud and outspoken as you could possibly be, not because you naturally like taking up space, but because deep down, you believe that nobody will listen to you unless you're really loud, unless you start shouting, See, for a lot of us, our false self is a self we built brick by brick a long time ago because it was the only way we knew how to stay safe in a world that felt unsafe, that felt unloving, that felt uncontrollable, in a world that made us feel like, okay, if I just stay quiet, if I keep everyone happy, if I'm always upbeat and positive, if I never need anything, then I'll be okay. Then people will like me. And what began as survival soon became our identity. And that's actually really important to name, because if you just hear someone stand up here and say, hey, so stop being so critical, stop being so controlling, without ever asking you what part of you that was protecting you from, all you're being asked to do is change your behavior. But see, this can't just be a behavior modification project. It has to be a Jesus project. Because the only way you tell a hypercritical eye it's safe to stop scanning for danger is if you actually believe you're being watched over by someone else. The only way a controlling hand can open back up is if it believes someone else is actually holding everything together. What we all need to realize is that safety and love and belonging were never actually ours to earn in the first place. And here's what that looks like for someone like me, right? It's not that I become a different person. I'm still a 9, right? God still made me a peacemaker. I still notice the temperature of a room before I notice almost anything else. I still care about being a non-anxious presence for people. That will always be how I'm wired. But when I'm operating out of my false self, when I believe my acceptance has to be earned, the way I make peace is by becoming a people pleaser, by avoiding the truth. But see, when I'm operating out of my true self, out of the self that's secure in God's love for me, now what's driving that part of my personality is not fear of disappointing someone or being rejected, but a desire to love and care for others in the ways God has loved and cared for me. So it's repurposing the same personality with a different motivation, right? Extroversion and introversion aren't fruits of the Spirit, right? It's not that you're introverted and then you meet Jesus and all of a sudden you become extroverted. Right? It's not that, you were this like funny, happy-go-lucky person and then you meet Jesus and you become this really contemplative, somber, serious person. No. Our personality are different means by which we express the fruit of the Spirit that are growing in us. An extrovert and an introvert loves people in 2 different ways. An extrovert and an introvert brings joy to people in 2 different ways, and it's beautiful. And that's the invitation for every single one of you today, whatever your wiring is. Not a new personality, not a suppressed personality, but a surrendered personality. And I promise you, the version of you that's fully surrendered to Christ is so much more free, so much more alive than the version of you that's just been managing yourself your whole life. And when you live out of this identity, you start to see the unique ways you've been wired, not as liabilities to overcome, but as gifts to steward for the whole body. See, when every part of the body is operating out of their true self, you don't just get healthier individuals, you get a healthier body. You get a body that functions the way a body should. You get a church that can carry mission the way it was always meant to. I'm a creative at heart, so there have been times when I've thought to myself, man, leading this church would be so much easier if everyone was a musician. Then they would understand how my mind works, they would think like me. But then I think about it for 10 seconds and I'm like, oh, no, that would be devastating, right? There would be no structure. Right? Everyone would just be doing their own thing. Everything would be so dramatic, right? We would offer a membership class and people would be like, but what is membership, right? What is, let's back that up. Let's zoom out. What does it mean to be a member, right? And I'm like, no. We need different kinds of people all playing their respective roles in the body. People secure in who they are and whose they are. When you look at the life of Jesus, you see someone who is utterly secure in his identity. He never performed for acceptance. He never tried to become someone else to earn applause. He knew exactly who he was because he knew whose he was. Before Jesus preached a single sermon, before he performed a single miracle, before he called a single disciple, the Father spoke over him at his baptism and said, "This is my Son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased." His identity was never something he had to earn. His identity was never something in question. It was something he received. And because Jesus was so secure in the Father's love, he was free to pour himself out for the sake of others. And that's what makes the gospel such good news. Because when Jesus goes to the cross, he doesn't just forgive our sins. No, he also dismantles the lie that you and I have to build a false self in order to be loved. Because on the cross, while we were yet sinners, while we were unlovable, Christ died for us. On the cross, Jesus takes upon himself all of our striving, our pretending, our performing, our exhausting attempts to prove that we're enough. And in his resurrection, he offers us not just a clean slate, but a new identity. Through Christ, the words spoken over Jesus become, by grace, the deepest truth about us as well, that we are sons and daughters whom the Father loves. We were accepted before we achieved. We were delighted in before we performed. And when you no longer have to earn love, you no longer have to wear someone else's armor. You're finally free to become the person God created you to be. You know, I'm reminded of the old children's story, The Ugly Duckling. And I feel like all adults should go revisit the stories that were read to them when we were younger, because they're so much more profound. They hit so much harder when you're an adult. Like, we need bedtime stories for adults, right? Someone needs to read me this every night, okay? And if you know the story, you have this duckling that hatches into a barnyard and spends his whole life believing something's wrong with him. He's too big, he's too gray, he's too clumsy. The other ducks mock him. He spends all his energy trying to shrink himself, trying to swim like them, quack like them, fit into a shape he was never built for. And every single day he wakes up and believes the same lie. I'm a broken duck. But here's what nobody in the barnyard could tell him, because none of them had the eyes to see it. He was never a duck to begin with. He was a swan. Every single thing that made him wrong by duck standards, his size, his shape, the way he moved through the water, was never a flaw. It was evidence of divine design. It was evidence of what he actually was, being measured by a standard he was never meant to fit. I think a lot of us spend our whole lives in a barnyard, measuring ourselves against these arbitrary standards we were never made for. I'm too quiet. I'm too intense. I'm too sensitive. I'm too much for people. I'm not enough for people. But this passage forces us to ask ourselves, what if the parts of you that you're ashamed of and most embarrassed about, what if those are the very parts God wants to heal, redeem, and offer back to the world as a gift? You know, as much as I've struggled with my own imposter syndrome as a pastor, my wife, Carol, has walked through her own version of that as a pastor's wife. Okay, and if you were at the worship night on Friday, I shared a little bit of my story, but when we got married, I was not a pastor. Being a pastor was not in the cards. Ministry was not even a glimmer in my mind, okay? So my wife to this day feels I bait and switched her, okay? And so she was always like nobody prepared me for this, right? She's an introvert. She gets social anxiety. After church, you see her running across our campus, like looking for our kids just to try to get home. Like at Easter Sunday this year, people thought she was the vendor in charge of the photo booth, so they're asking her like take pictures for them. She tries to keep a low profile, and so many times, like she'll be like, "I'm not built for this role." And part of that is growing up in a Korean immigrant church where pastors' wives had a very specific mold, right? They were expected to talk a certain way, look a certain way, behave a certain way. And so many days she's like, I'm not like that. And on her worst days, she really starts to believe the lie that our community is very disappointed in her that she's not like that. But see, when she says things like this, in fact, when any of us say things like this, we're not just being hard on ourselves, we're actually making a claim about our Maker. We're saying that God, when He formed us to be the people that we are, somehow made a mistake. Right? I imagine, if you're a parent in the room, imagine like what you would feel as a parent, how offended you would feel if your child said they would rather be someone else, rather live someone else's life. Can you imagine how God, who formed us with intention and care, feels about us? And can you imagine how it breaks His heart when we think those things about ourselves? No, God knew exactly the type of person the world needed. God knew exactly what kind of parent your child needed. God knew what kind of leader your team needed, what kind of pastor's wife your church needed. The greatest tragedy is not that you never become someone else. The greatest tragedy would be if you spend your whole life rejecting the masterpiece God already made. The goal of your life is not to become someone worthy of love. No, the goal of your life is to become the person God has loved all along. And that would be my hope for this church, for this community, that every person in here would begin to see, no, I was made with a purpose. I'm not an accident. And I can participate in God's mission in New York and in the world in a way that only I can. Would you join me in prayer?